Welcome to Stronger Than Reason, episode 20. So it's been a little while. What's been going on? Things are getting warmer where I live. There's been more to do than hide in the basement just making podcasts and videos. So I've been getting out into the world, watching spring happen. So maybe there'll be more space in between episodes going forward. But for now, here I am again. But hey, 20 episodes. It's pretty hard to believe that I found the energy to make 20 of these. Believe it or not, I put quite a bit of effort into each one. I try to do a bit of research to make sure things like my facts and my timelines are right. Because, I'm getting older. It's kind of hard to hold all of this band trivia in my head like I used to, and I find that I do think I know it all, but sometimes I get the details mixed up, and you kids out there, you'll learn what I'm talking about someday. So yeah, I do a little bit of fact-checking, very little. I was recently vindicated, though, because in the last episode, which was about the art of noise, I made an assertion that the Art of Noise were the first band to use that big gated snare drum sound that we hear so much in the 80s. And I just happened to be listening to some of Rick Rubin's podcast, which is called Broken Record. It's a very good podcast, very interesting. I recommend it. But it was the episode with the Beastie Boys. And they happened to be talking about that gated snare drum sound. And I immediately thought of the Art of Noise. And then Rick said, yeah, I think it was the Art of Noise that popularized that. So, yeah, I was happy because I guess I got that point right. Because Lord knows I don't want to spread misinformation or fake news, so I'm doing my research here. But I would have thought that I would have gotten tired of this podcast and stuff already. It's not like, I don't have a million other things to do, like I'm sure you do. But there are still some albums and bands I want to talk about, and I have to say it's been great to get some feedback from you all. It's really encouraging. I think it's pretty cool to find some like-minded people through the internet who are talking about something other than politics. So for those of you who've reached out, thank you. And I've tried to reply to each of you, and I think it's good for us to have a bit of a chat about this stuff that we love, this music that we love. And as the great Ken Highwatt Marshall says, thanks for engaging with the channel. Those who know. Anyway, I've started thinking about possibly talking about some other things related to music rather than just doing strict album reviews. But, we'll see how that goes. I'm starting to think about other ways I could take this. But today's episode is sort of different, too. I'm not going to talk about just one album, obviously. I'm going to talk about a band. And, if I'm being real, some of the previous episodes were not just me talking about single albums, because in each of them, I've gone pretty far into the band's history and have at least mentioned some of the other albums that they've done. So in this series so far, I have not yet revisited a band. I think that will be interesting when I do, since I won't have to rehash all of the background material again. I think those episodes would probably be shorter, which I guess is a good thing. Who has time or interest to sit through a 40-minute podcast or video in this day and age? I don't know. What do you think? Would you like shorter content, maybe posted more regularly, or would you prefer longer content posted less often and maybe going into more depth? Let me know. And I tend to think these days people have a very short attention span, but I think that's true until you get to something that you really love. And if you get to something you really love, suddenly you're snapped in and you don't mind going down that rabbit hole. On the other hand, I'm not sure anyone has the patience to listen to me for more than a few minutes. And that's kind of borne out by the YouTube analytics. But anyway, let's see where things go. For now, I'm just going to focus on this one band. And this isn't a band that I was into at all much back in their heyday. In fact, I wouldn't get into them until much later, until around 1998. So at that point, they were already 10 years into their career and arguably past their sell-by date. And what is this band? What is this band that I'm referring to? It's a real mystery. The band, of course, was The Orb, and you know that because you've read the title of this show, obviously, and there's no point being coy or silly about it. But if I go back and think about the early 90s, I definitely knew that the Orb existed, and I knew, rave music existed. I couldn't tell you what the Orb sounded like at that time. As I may have mentioned, I used to spend a lot of time in used record stores. It was one of my major hobbies, I'd have to say. And naturally, I would come across my share of Orb albums and singles, and I'd kind of pick them up and look at them from time to time, but I never bought them. And why not? I think because I had heard somewhere that the Orb made ambient music. And, I wasn't very sophisticated back then. And to be honest, I'm not that sophisticated right now. But back then, I was even less so. And I hadn't heard of any of Brian Eno's classic ambient albums. These days, I have a pretty good Brian Eno collection. But back then, I figured ambient music was pretty much equivalent to elevator music, which here in the United States, at least, we call muzak. And I knew that I wasn't at all interested in muzak. And it just sounded to me like kind of new agey. And I did have a friend or two who were into that new age electronic music too, which is a whole other episode I think I'd need to do. But I knew I liked electronic music, but for the most part, that music had to have an edge. It had to be aggressive. And in my mind, electronic plus aggressive equaled industrial. And I knew I liked industrial rock. So I was pretty hesitant to pick up this album, their first album, which is The Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. I mean, I'd look at it and think, oh, what is this? Is this muzak? I don't know. I'd like turn the disc over in my hands, and I'd check the packaging for clues. And hell, wouldn't you know it, the first track is called Little Fluffy Clouds. And if that isn't a muzak title, what is? So, yeah, I said nope and just put it back. And that must have happened time and again. I remember picking up that album so many times, and I came so close to diving in and just didn't. But it makes me think, what was I even doing in the O's section anyway? I mean, was I looking for OMD, Roy Orbison? I don't know. I think the fact of the matter is that I used to just look at every single record in the store, and it's hard to imagine having that kind of free time anymore. Just hundreds of hours spent combing through bins. And, when I got a bit older, out of school, and I had a car, I would make road trips to every record store in the region. And it was nothing to me to spend a whole afternoon just driving hours away to hit up a record store. And it was worth it because I'd find crazy imports and rare stuff, just enough to encourage me to keep doing it. And that lasted pretty much as long as those stores were prevalent, as long as they were around. And they all pretty much went away there around the year 2000 or so. Shortly thereafter, they all went out of business, except for the ones now that are selling vinyl. And you all know my feelings about vinyl. Don't have hard feelings about it, but I'm just not going to collect it. Nope, not doing it. So anyway, going back again to the early 90s, the mid 90s, I had attended a few raves and was learning a little more about techno. I guess you could say I was techno curious. And, sooner or later, I had bought an 808 State record, and it was inevitable that I'd eventually come around to the Orb. And that finally happened in 1998, as I mentioned. Yeah, 1998, as I said, a whole decade past their heyday, and nearly a decade after the so-called second summer of love. And when I finally bit, I didn't even pick up Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. They had just come out at that time with their fourth album, which was Orblivion. And for whatever reason, this is the disc that I picked up. So let's talk about first hearing the Orb? This was the first Orb I ever listened to, so what were my first impressions? I have to say I was very pleasantly surprised that it wasn't elevator music at all. It wasn't purely ambient. It was this newer thing that they called ambient house. So it was instrumental, but it was definitely dance music, and it had a pretty hefty beat. In fact, it was not wholly unlike the industrial music that I was familiar with, but it was different in attitude. So the Orb wasn't so aggressive, but it was weirder. It had a bunch of samples, and at times it was downright funky, but it had a different kind of energy. It was kind of playful and generally more lighthearted and uplifting. And I know, it's nobody wants to hear about music that's lighthearted. Let's really get into the aggressive, horrible stuff. But that's my impression of this album anyway. Some of the standout tracks here were, for me, Delta Mark II, which is the lead-off track, was just a really cool, groovy tune. And, of course, Toxigene, which was one of the big singles off this album. And this was actually one of their comeback albums, as we'll talk about. And they had several over their career, but they were in something like a slump at this time. But Toxigene, I guess, had started life as a remix of Jean-Michel Jarre's song Oxygene, and supposedly Jarre nixed it for being too weird, which we'll talk more about. That goes into the discussion of the Orb's remix work. That was another way that I first heard the Orb, through their remixes. In particular, they did some remixes that were very popular for this band you may have heard of called Depeche Mode, and these remixes caught my ear early on, even back when I was in high school. But the one that blew me away was their mix of a song called Happiest Girl, which, as you may know, was a B-side to World in My Eyes. And what struck me about that, here it is, Happiest Girl, the pulsating orbital mix. What struck me about that was how it sounded so little like the original, yet it contained all the elements of it, and it just elevated it to this whole other level. So it was a really long track that just went on, and I knew from experience, though, that it could fill a dance floor, because I remember hearing DJs play that in clubs when I was in school, and it was just a very heavy and beautiful and unique version of that song. And I quickly learned that the Orb were notorious for their off-the-wall remixes. Another one that I heard early on was their remix of a track called Sunset Gun by this short-lived industrial supergroup called The Damage Manual. And this was another remix that surpassed the original. And what I really love about it is that it contains an obvious preset from one of my very favorite drum machines, the venerable Korg ER1. And I can actually play that for you here. Let's give it a try. There you go. There it is. Just a minute. So that's the preset that they lifted right off of this drum machine and dumped into their mix. And it totally worked. I think that's great. But I actually have an ER1, of course. I mean, everybody does, right? And if you don't have an ER1, you should totally go out and get one, because it's one of the most retro cool drum machines that you'll ever find. And it's super fun to just play with. Anyway, it also has one of the greatest user interfaces of any musical equipment that's been made in the last 30 years. So definitely go check it out. So yeah, a bit later in my exploration of the Orb and their music, I picked up this remix compilation called Anti-Aubrey's Excursions Beyond the Call of Duty. And this came in two parts. There were parts 1 and 2. And what these did was they collected the best of their remix work that they did for other artists. And I think I bought the first one just because I was completely sucked in by the awesome album art. I mean, that's just an amazing cover there. But there's some truly unique and bizarre stuff on these remixes. One of my favorites is this really unsettling mix by an obscure band called Inner Sphere of their song Out of Body. And the Orb threw in these crazy samples from the movie Flatliners. It's just a great track. You got to check it out. I think this part 2 actually came in several different editions depending on whether you were in the US or the UK, and I made a point to get the UK version because it had some bands I really just had to hear. So a lot of stuff to dig into there. But yeah, overall at this point I thought the Orb were pretty relatable and poppy, so I decided to jump back into their catalog and just start from the beginning. I went out and picked up Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld, and at long last I dropped the proverbial needle on that lead-off track, Little Fluffy Clouds. And, you know, I learned what you all know, that it wasn't some new age pap after all. It was actually this house banger with super funky rhythm and some iconic samples of LeVar Burton interviewing Ricky Lee Jones on Reading Rainbow. And of course now it's one of their most famous tracks. It's just a classic. This track and some of the others introduced me to a couple other aspects of the Orb that weren't really evident on Orblivion. So one was their sense of humor. I mean, a band has to have a sense of humor with track titles like Backside of the Moon and a huge ever-growing pulsating brain that rules from the center of the Ultraworld. Another thing that became clear was their psychedelia. I mean, I got the Pink Floyd reference in Backside of the Moon. I think if you open this up, there's a picture, there it is, of Battersea Power Station, which was on, of course, the cover of Pink Floyd's Animals. So I get these, like, Pink Floyd connections. Or, you know, I see the band making them, but I didn't really understand why those pictures and references were there until I really listened to the whole album. And the answer is that the Orb's idea of ambient music was not unlike early Pink Floyd. So the stuff like Pink Floyd were playing here on the live side of the Ummagumma album. Okay, so stuff like, you know, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and Careful with That Axe, Eugene. Those sort of longer pieces that they would play that were a bit more unstructured and meandering. You know, that was what they considered space rock back in the classic rock days. But the Orb were kind of doing the same thing, but in a more modern take. And that kind of made sense to me then after listening to this album. Even songs that Pink Floyd did, like Echoes, later in their career sort of followed that. And the Orb weren't a space rock band or a jam band, but they were trippy. So the beats and the pop stuff were woven together with more unstructured stuff, improvs and loose jams and all these nutty samples thrown into the mix. So I'm about as far from a Deadhead as you can get, but I've hung out with enough Deadheads over the years to understand that the Dead did this kind of thing because they would intersperse these improv jams into their sets, the stuff like drums and space, and it's the same idea, right? It's the same sort of thing going on. Not that the Orb is much like the Grateful Dead, but it's just an approach to music. So the other thing about this album was that these tracks were given alternate titles that suggested a space voyage from Earth to the so-called Ultraworld. So the first track, Little Fluffy Clouds, was Earth Orbit 1, and the second track, Earth Gaia, was Earth Orbit 2. And, you know, eventually we get down here to Lunar Orbit, and then the Ultraworld probes, and then finally to the Ultraworld itself. So the tracks get a little nuttier and nuttier as you go along, suggesting a journey, which is kind of cool. Almost all of these tracks would become ambient house classics and would be mixed and remixed endlessly, as we'll talk about later. But some of the other standouts on this album, besides Little Fluffy Clouds, were, of course, Perpetual Dawn, huge party tune, and of course a huge ever-growing pulsating brain. So the latter was this 20-minute jam that closed the album, and it turned out it was one of their first tracks. But to really dig into that, we have to go back into who these people were. So who were the Orb? Who was involved with this band? So the Orb had their start as DJs in London in the late 80s at a club called Heaven. And they started out essentially as two people. There was Alex Patterson, who had been a former roadie for Killing Joke, and Jimmy Cauty, who at the time was something of a session guitarist, having worked with Youth, also known as Martin Glover, who was Killing Joke's original bassist. So the deal was that Youth and Jimmy had been in a pop band together, and that band was called Brilliant, and it was fronted by June Montana, and they had songs written by the classic songwriting team of Stock Aitken and Waterman, and they were set up to become the next big thing. But for whatever reason, oddly, it didn't take off, and they ended up dissolving. So I have to point out that, Jimmy Cauty would go on to some notoriety as half of the KLF a few years down the road. And, of course, he would one day be legendary as the man who burnt 1 million pounds. But for more on that, you have to go back and listen to episode 16, which is all about the KLF. But anyway, among his other accomplishments, he helped co-found the Orb. So let's talk about Alex Patterson for a minute, and you'll often hear him referred to as Dr. Alex Patterson. And at first, this impressed me. I was like, wow, he's a doctor, like a medical doctor? Or maybe he's a PhD, and he's out there making this crazy rave music? I mean, how cool is that? The only PhD I knew of offhand that was active in professional music and was quite popular would be Brian May of Queen, who's an honest-to-God astrophysicist and who regularly publishes original research. I mean, that guy is objectively brilliant, but I haven't heard of anyone else like that. So to hear that Alex Patterson was a doctor, that was pretty interesting to me. However, Wikipedia eventually came around and explained the real story, which is that it's just a nickname, because his full name is Duncan Alexander Robert Patterson. So if you switch those names around a bit, you get Dr. Alex Patterson, hence doctor. So less impressive, but still kind of funny. Anyway, after Brilliant fell apart, Jimmy got restless and started working with Alex as a DJ. Their big innovation was to work the so-called chill-out room in the club Heaven in London, playing music that didn't have drums. So go out, party all night, take questionable substances, and really get into the heavy music. And after all that, at about 4 or 5 in the morning, you want to chill out and listen to something a bit more mellow. So they would interweave all sorts of material like bird songs, voice recordings, train whistles, sound effects. So at first, that was truly something closer to Brian Eno's idea of ambient music. But the first real Orb track that they perfected was this thing that sampled Minnie Riperton's Loving You, which they eventually renamed to a huge, ever-growing, pulsating brain that rules from the center of the Ultraworld. Yeah. And that track, maybe because of its goofy title, drew more interest. So they commenced doing more recordings at Jimmy's flat, which, of course, was the legendary Trans Central, which was immortalized by the KLF. However, they had a falling out and decided to go their separate ways. Jimmy released his contributions to those sessions separately as the album called Space on their KLF Communications label that he shared with Bill Drummond. And eventually, the KLF would release their ambient masterpiece, which was this, Chill Out. More on this later, but at the time, Alex Patterson would object, saying that the bulk of this recording was either made by him or was based on his own DJ sessions at Trans Central. Now, the world may never know the truth, but Chill Out is, in fact, a landmark, and it's an ambient album, though. It's not really ambient house. It has very few, if any, beats on here, and it's more akin to what the Orb were doing in the Chill Out room at Heaven, hence the title, Chill Out. And again, this cover is also another Pink Floyd reference because it references the cover of Adam Hart Mother, which of course has just a cow standing in a field. But this is also a reference to raves where they would often occur in the English countryside, and this is what you'd be looking at 6 in the morning when the rave was over. So anyway, yes, Alex in the meantime began working with youth on what would become Little Fluffy Clouds and the rest of the Orb's first album. And of course, they'd start moving away from purely ambient music and go further and further into this new genre they were creating called ambient house. Basically, ambient music with beats. So the music would still have these psychedelic bits and weird samples, but it would have some actual song structures and actual beats that could work in a club setting. And around this time with the Orb, a few other folks were getting involved. There was Andy Falconer, there was Chris Weston, who was also known as Thrash, and a guy named Andy Hughes, and even a few others that were lurking about. So I soon picked up their second album, which was U.F.Orb, and this might be my favorite for 2 songs in particular. One is called Blue Room, and it was their second breakthrough single after Little Fluffy Clouds, and they originally released it as, believe it or not, a 40-minute song, which at the time was the limit for what could be considered a single. And they did it just to be bastards, which you have to admire, and it landed them a spot on top of the pops where they didn't even bother pretending to recreate the track live. Instead, Alex and Thrash famously dressed like astronauts and played a game of chess while they played a very edited version of the track. And that alone was a classic bit of early 90s pop culture. But I also love that song's bass line, which was performed by Jaw Wobble, who of course was the original bassist in Public Image Limited, and associate of the Sex Pistols, and a legend in his own right for various reasons. But really funky stuff. It also featured some other 70s icons playing on it. It had Miket Garati and Steve Hillage of System 7 and Gong, and they would become on and off Orb collaborators over subsequent years, even until recently. So yeah, Blue Room is a really hypnotic and groovy track. The album version here is quite a bit shorter. It's just 17 minutes. So yeah, an edit. But you can get the full 40-minute version. I think you can get it on Apple Music. You can get it on a separate single. The other track that I love on U.F.Orb is called Majestic, and it might be my favorite Orb track of all. And why is that? I'm not sure why I love it so much. I think if I had to really consider, it would probably be because of this incredibly funky synth part that comes in and out of it. And I can't describe it very well. It's not really bass, but it's this syncopated synth rhythm that just really moves the song along and just makes it really fun to listen to. And I also like what sounds like some fretless bass on here, although it's hard to tell if it was actually a fretless bass or just synth. Hard to say, but Majestic is really an awesome track. Might be my favorite Orb track overall. This album had a few more classic tracks on it, like U.F.Orb and Towers of Dub and Close Encounters. So it's pretty similar to the first album in that they were continuing with this kind of space travel theme, but that wouldn't last much longer. So in 93 or so, they moved to Island Records and released an EP called Pomme Fritz, or the Orb's Little Album. And this blew some minds. It was way more experimental than their usual ambient house sound. It was based a lot more on sampling and textures and musique concrète, and critics really panned it because it was really noisy and it didn't yield any big club hits. But historically, it was important because it was Alex's first collaboration with Thomas Fellman, and he'd become another on-off collaborator and would have a strong sway on how the Orb did things in the albums released in the 2000s. But this EP, Pomme Fritz, isn't really a favorite of mine, but I do appreciate that it staked out some experimental territory. I think the Orb, had a lot of potential as an experimental band as well. And it showed that there was more to them than just catering to the post-rave crowd. So their next proper album was Orbus Terrarum, which they released in 1995. And this stands out in my mind because it has more of an Earth theme. So no space travel. There's a lot of sounds from nature here. There's forests and rain and wind and animals and so on. And it's a pretty good example of what I think of as kind of organic techno. And for sure, other bands took this idea and ran with it in a more, crunchy granola kind of way over subsequent years and kind of made a career out of this subgenre. Not to name any names, but again, this album failed to deliver the fat beats and wasn't much of a critical hit at the time. So again, in my mind, it's more of the Orb just kind of staking out their territory. Like, we want to be able to do this, we want to be able to do that. All of this stuff is the Orb. And that's why I say they were in a bit of a slump whenever they released Orblivion in 1997. So this was something of a comeback that redeemed them in the critics' eyes, having more than a few club hits. So at this point in my reviewing their material, I was kind of caught up. And I had to think, why did I like this stuff? What was it about their music that was bringing me in? And, I liked that it was largely instrumental. As a guy in IT, this was music I could appreciate while working. And I could just listen to it and do my job without getting distracted, because vocals immediately distract me. And I can't be reading and listening to vocals. It just doesn't work. And I think the same is true for a lot of people. You can have an instrumental track and not think too much of it, but as soon as you put vocals on it, your attention is just riveted to the vocals, and the instruments just are backing noise. So without the vocals doing that, the instruments have a lot of room and a lot of space, and they can carry the song without that focus of a vocal. And somehow the Orb are really good at keeping their songs interesting even without vocals. And some of that is due to clever use of samples, and also just their instrumentation. Their arrangements are really dense, and, listening to their songs is just a different experience to listening to a song with a vocalist on it. Generally, it's more relaxing. I find it's kind of more abstract in a way. I'm not getting hung up on words and meanings. There's no personality getting in the way of the music. With a vocalist, that person is kind of imposing their personality on the song. They're speaking directly to me, but I, as another person, have to sort of grapple with what this other person is saying. So, sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, depending on the vocalist. And the Orb just sidestepped that whole issue for the most part. It's just me and the music, which I liked. The other thing I liked was just the sheer depth of their catalog. I mean, they were prolific. They put out a lot of studio albums, a lot of singles, a lot of compilations, a lot of rarities, a lot of remixes. And I appreciated that I could grab any of these things and just put it on and get lost in the music for an hour or so without having to think too hard about it. So I had a bunch of albums to choose from. I found that whatever album I was listening to, the ambient bits tended to glue the different tracks together into what became a seamless whole. So the whole thing was like a listening experience, listening to an album from end to end without shuffling. It was like going on a trip or a journey. And there was a lot of creativity packed in there because they didn't rely on just having a vocalist come on and say things. So they had to go the extra mile and find the strange sounds and the samples and the textures and the melodies. And with the possible exception of Pomme Fritz, it was always groovy and always modern, whatever they were coming up with. So for me, it was just such a unique listening experience. And I know there are other bands that were doing what the Orb was doing. They're not unique in that sense, but they were a pioneer at the time, when electronic music was really taking off. So, oddly enough, I had gotten into listening to jazz music for a lot of these same reasons, because it was largely instrumental and dense and could be groovy, and I could just get lost in it. And I could listen while I was working. It didn't distract me too much. I picked up a box set of Blue Note records, for instance, and a bunch of other stuff, like Miles Davis albums, Stanley Jordan. And I'm not saying the Orb was jazzy, but it might have been jazz adjacent with the improvisational aspects of it and just the sheer depth of the listening experience. Because the Orb were not really pop music. There was no verse, chorus, verse, but it was creative still, and it was complex, and it was fascinating, and it was different. And I kind of found similar things listening to jazz. And again, it fit my lifestyle as someone who got paid to sit at a computer for 8 hours a day. I could just put an Orb album on my headphones and just sort of bliss out while I coded away. So it gave me a chance to appreciate them in a way that I couldn't do with other artists. So anyway, at this point, I was firmly on the Orb train, and I was keeping up with their next few albums. And only some of these I bought on CD, because at this point I was buying stuff on iTunes. iPods were a thing. So Cydonia came out in 2001, and this was a pretty cool album. It was really the first of theirs to feature a couple proper songs with guest vocalists. So they started sounding more and more, in some cases anyway, like an actual pop band. So that was controversial, I suppose, among the critics at the time. Are the Orbs selling out? I don't know, but it was probably inevitable. And 808 State started doing the same thing, honestly. I think it was just cool to have, a well-known or new up-and-coming vocalist on your otherwise instrumental album. They came out with another album called Bicycles and Tricycles in 2004. I only have a digital copy of that, but I really like one track in particular on that, which was called G Strings. And at this point, I was really sensing the presence of Thomas Fellman in these recordings, and his influence was to pull the Orb into more minimalistic techno. His songs were based on these little micro samples and were generally more repetitive, without as many of the big goofy samples that Alex Patterson liked. But still, these songs could be tremendously funky, and G Strings is an example of that on Bicycles and Tricycles. And he would pretty much take over their next album, which was called Okie Dokie, It's the Orb on Compact. And Compact being a German label that Thomas Fellman released his own stuff on, and it catered to that whole minimalistic techno vibe. And that's very much what this album is. There are few, if any, vocal samples, just tiny blips and bleeps arranged into these groovy instrumentals. Not much here in the way of Alex Patterson's classic psychedelia or goofiness. I have some of Thomas Fellman's solo stuff, and it sounds like that. For instance, his album Honig Pump sounds a lot like this album. And to the point where I wonder if Alex just gave Fellman permission to do his own album as the Orb for the heck of it. I don't know. But that's a bit of an outlier. Okie Dokie is a bit of an outlier among their catalog. But again, it's sort of staking out that territory. The Orb could do minimalistic techno as well as anybody else. It's just another example of how versatile they were as a band. Then they came out with The Dream in 2007, and this was a surprising album for me because it moved things firmly back to Alex. So Thomas Fellman wasn't on this at all. So they went in a completely different direction here. This was like Alex reclaiming his territory. So I love this album. It has these big, lush beats, has real instrumentation on it, even with like guest vocalists, so much more of a pop album. And the production on this album is fantastic. The songs sound like fully fledged pop tunes, and still with the Orb's trademark humor and weird samples. It's just really a tour de force. There's some great stuff here, and Youth did a lot of the co-writing and production. And of course, by 2007, Youth was a very successful musician and record producer. He had worked with tons of successful artists like The Verve and U2, Susie and the Banshees. He was also in a band with Paul McCartney, for Christ's sakes. I mean, how many people who weren't Beatles or in Wings could say that? None. And those two released several albums as the Fireman, which I urge you to check out if you haven't already. But yeah, it was good to have Youth back in the Orb fold. The Dream is a great album. Check it out. There were some other collaborations going on around this time, the early 2000s. As I said, the Orb remixed hundreds of bands, often making the original tracks completely unrecognizable. I think Thomas Fellman was quoted as saying that bands knew when they hired the Orb to remix them that they were really going to get an original Orb song, not a remix at all, for better or worse. And again, you can check a lot of examples of those out on these Annie Aubrey collections. But after Pomme Fritz, Patterson, Weston, and Fellman teamed up with Robert Fripp of King Crimson, who certainly got around as a collaborator. And those four released an album called FFWD. And that was very experimental, kind of in the vein of Pomme Fritz. And it was mostly weird ambient music with few, if any, beats. And I don't have a copy of it. It's not really my thing. I've listened to it on YouTube a bit. I can't comment on it too much, but if you like Pomme Fritz, I totally suggest checking out FFWD. And then, strangely enough, Alex Patterson rejoined Jimmy Cauty, at least for a little while, in a short-lived band called the Transit Kings. And they released an album and a few singles, and it was mostly this poppy techno, which is actually quite good. And if I recall, it had some world music influences, it had some vocalists on it, and it was pretty groovy. I like the Transit Kings. I still listen to that album from time to time. And again, I only have it on electronic copy, of course. Maybe I should pick up a hard copy. That's a good one to have. But I also like this project because it features Guy Pratt, who, of course, played live bass for Pink Floyd when they reunited in the 80s after Roger Waters left. So, in a way, this project, Transit Kings, would strengthen the Orb's Pink Floyd associations. And at this point, I have to stop and say that Guy Pratt has a great podcast with Gary Kemp of Spandau Ballet, and it's called Rock on Tours. And it's just what you would think it is. It's like, those two interviewing famous rock and roll people, telling stories and anecdotes, and it's pretty fascinating, so check it out. And of course, they're both currently playing in Nick Mason's Saucerful of Secrets band, with Gary Kemp singing and playing guitar, and Guy Pratt playing bass. Nick Mason, of course, being Pink Floyd's drummer and longest-serving member, and just a legend. I mean, I love me some Pink Floyd, but that's got to be a whole other episode, guys. But speaking of Pink Floyd, I had some very exciting news in 2010 because the Orb announced that they would be releasing an album with David Gilmour himself, Pink Floyd's frontman in the 80s and 90s, and probably my favorite guitarist ever. It's tough to say whether he beats out Alex Lifeson in my book, but this album did eventually come out as Metallic Spheres, and of course, I only have this digitally. But it was pretty interesting, although it wasn't exactly what I expected. First of all, I don't think Alex really worked with David Gilmour at all. I think, from what I read, everything was mediated by Youth, who was, after all, someone who had access to all of the classic rock royalty. But I get the impression that David just jammed out for a few hours and sent the tapes to Youth, who worked with Alex to kind of hammer them into songs. I think that's how it went down, but oddly, they released the digital version, again, which is what I have, as just these two long tracks. So, like side A and side B. So, listening to it is kind of a weird, inconvenient experience if you're used to, modern digital technology and individual tracks. But still, these are like quibbles, because here was an actual member of Pink Floyd, David Gilmour himself, on an Orb album. So, like, what's not to love? In some ways, this album gets mixed up in my mind with the final Pink Floyd album, which was The Endless River. Both of them were mostly these ambient kind of jams with that trademark Gilmour guitar flowing in and out, but not much in the way of coherent songs or songwriting. But yeah, Metallic Spheres was a culmination of sorts with the Orb's long history of being associated with Pink Floyd and being something like a modernized Pink Floyd. It seemed only natural for them to actually team up with David Gilmour at some point. So that was great to see. And there were more in the way of legendary team-ups here in the 2000s. And I have to mention the other albums that they released with Lee Scratch Perry in 2012 and 2013. Again, bought those two in iTunes, don't have physical copies. But they were called The Orbserver in the Star House, and the second was More Tales from the Orbservatory. These had Alex and Thomas Fellman with Lee Perry, who was just mostly contributing these freestyle vocals. And I think they did a remake of one of his classic reggae tracks, Police and Thieves, which was really cool. Lee Perry, of course, is just a legend, one of the pioneers in dub reggae, both as a producer and as a performer, and just as a real character in his own right. So there is some great stuff on these albums. They're a lot of fun to listen to. They're really dubby, not minimal techno at all, even though Thomas Fellman's on them. There's some great deep bass and trippy delays, just classic dub stuff with Lee Perry's inimitable voice. And I understand they planned just one album, but they wound up with enough material for two. So that was good news for me because I just snapped up both. So where are they now? The Orb are still releasing music pretty regularly. They have 5 more studio albums they released after the albums with Lee Perry that I haven't really even listened to yet. They came out with Moon Building 2703 AD in 2015. In 2016, they came out with, I think it was called Cow Chill Out World. In 2018 was No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. 2020 was Abolition of the Royal Familia. And just a couple weeks ago, they came out with their latest album, which is called Prism. I think Youth was involved with most of these. I don't even know if Thomas Fellman is still working with the Orb or not. I have no idea. But all of those are just still on my to-buy list. So there's still plenty more fresh Orb out there for me to dig into and discover. I mean, they just come out with so much music. It's really hard to keep up with all of it. And there are just tons of compilations and other things, too. So they have this early best of that I picked up a long time ago called U.F.Orb. Again, you just gotta love the pun and the giant middle finger taking off on the cover. It's just classic. And this has remixes of a lot of their material from the 90s. This is a 2-disc set. I don't even remember how these things open anymore. But just a zillion tracks on here from the first 4 or 5 albums remixed and, whatever, a lot of various ways. So a lot of cool stuff on here. And there's a whole other album series they have called Orb Sessions. I think there's at least 3 volumes of the Orb Session series that have extra tracks and rarities and B-sides and things like that. They have a classic live album called Live 93, which is mostly material from the first album. And I mentioned the Anti-Aubrey remix compilations. A lot of neat stuff there. So just like a ton of material out there. And they're still playing live. I've never seen the Orb live. They went all the way back to DJing at Heaven. They started out as a live act. Visuals were always a very important part of a live show. I think they were one of the bands that pioneered the whole lasers and fog thing in the 90s with electronic music. And I think nowadays they do more of the backing films. What do they actually do on stage? Who knows? It's always a question with electronic musicians. And it's funny because Alex is mostly a DJ, which he'll just say straight up. So how he arranges these amazing pop songs with all this great instrumentation, I'm not sure. I guess if he's not just DJing all this music. I think he's bringing in a lot of collaborators to be able to put this kind of stuff together. But I don't really know. And maybe Youth is just playing all this music on here, and Alex is mixing it and producing it. I'm curious what their creative process really is, because when you see the Orb live, Alex is up there scratching vinyl and like mixing things in, and Thomas Fellman is up there running Ableton Live. He's thanked Ableton in a lot of his album credits, so I know he's an Ableton fan and user. But I don't really know what their setup is exactly, and I'm sure it changes. But yeah, these days, their live show is mostly two older dudes standing in front of a lot of gear with a bunch of cool backing films. But isn't that the dream we all have, to do that? Why do I love it? Again, I mentioned that I like to listen to the Orb when I work and when doing other things that require concentration. I really like their deep catalog. There's just so much to dig into and enjoy. And finally, I mentioned that I discovered them late, only after overcoming my initial aversion to them, thinking that they were elevator music, which they certainly were not. And more so, they've influenced my own music. I do make music, like a lot of people do these days. And I think the Orb taught me to think a bit more about the instrumental aspects of the songs I write. So I first try to make the tracks interesting without any vocals, because if it works as an instrumental, it's going to be a stronger track overall. So you have to think about things like the sound design, the arrangement, the timbre, the production, the effects. And I spend a lot of time on those aspects of the music before ever putting vocals on it. Like I said, as soon as you drop vocals on any track, the vocals become 60% of what anyone's going to listen to. It's just a huge distraction. And it's part of the human response. As one human, when you hear another human talking or singing, you're going to focus on that human as opposed to everything else. The rest of it's just window dressing. So the Orb helped me to appreciate the importance in the instrumental aspects of music. They for sure have made some of the most interesting electronic instrumental music. Like I said, they were pioneers with that stuff. And even their newer stuff still sounds fresh to me. They're not just rehashing old formulas. They're really coming up with new things, new approaches. Like I said, they've taken a lot of different turns and U-turns in their career, trying out different styles. So there's a lot to get into there. There's something pure about a band that's doing mostly instrumental music, but doing it in an interesting way. I mean, there are plenty of electronic acts out there, especially these days, that don't have vocals, because vocals are hard. Let's be real. And not everybody can pull them off. But most of those instrumental acts are just boring, in my opinion. And of course, nowadays, every moron with a copy of GarageBand can put out crappy instrumental music just like that, right? Just lay down a beat and some bass, and there you got a song. You're a musician, and 99% of that is just boring as hell. And yeah, you kids, get off my lawn. But a similar band to the Orb that comes to my mind is 808 State, in that they're not boring, but they do mostly instrumentals. But they're a band that were much more techno than the Orb. They were definitely more club-oriented, not as experimental, didn't really have the range of a band like the Orb. They're not really ambient at all, but there is a bit of overlap there, and sometime I would like to talk about my favorite 808 State album, but that's another episode. But there you have it, kids. Dr. Alex Patterson and the Orb have the prescription for what ails you. Again, let me know what you think about shorter versus longer episodes, or any other suggestions you have about the content you want to hear. And for those who've engaged with the channel so far, thank you. You have been listening to Stronger Than Reason, and we're available on YouTube and as a podcast, wherever you do the podcast thing. If you like what you heard, please do what they say, like and subscribe. It helps people find the show. And I'll just remind you that I'm one weird dude with an opinion. I encourage you to leave yours as a comment. And if you made it this far, you have my thanks and admiration. Until next time, stay strong.